occurred at the start of February. As you know, the military has seized power and incarcerated many elected officials from the National League for Democracy, including Aung San Suu Kyi. A civil disobedience movement has quickly sprung up among state employees, and mass protests have ensued on the streets across the country, culminating recently in a general strike, which has been undeterred by mass arrests and so far 8 confirmed deaths. The military has also released 23,000 prisoners from jail and unleashed thugs to attack protesters and terrorize civilian neighborhoods. The purpose of today's event is to analyze and explain what is going on, rather than simply engage in moral condemnation or political criticism, in the spirit that if you want to change the world, you must first understand it. So I'll speak first, and then I'll introduce the other speakers individually as we go along. The speakers will have about 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we'll open up to Q&A. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen anytime to ask a question or to make a comment. And you can also use the chat to discuss with one another. But if you do want the panel to see your comments or questions and you want them to respond, you should please use the Q&A function. So to begin, I want to focus on why the coup happened and what the military hoped to achieve. There has been a fairly simplistic commentary, I think, that the military simply couldn't tolerate a National League for Democracy victory and wanted its proxy party, the USDP, to do better. The difficulty with that explanation is that the military tolerated an NLD landslide and the massive defeat of the USDP in 2015. And so the key question is, what has changed since to make that intolerable for the military? The necessary context here is that the military has been and remains Myanmar's single most powerful social and political force. It was the military that designed the 2008 constitution. It took them 2 decades to craft and impose this and to quell societal opposition to the military. It gives the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, autonomy from civilian control, gives them control of 3 key ministries of Home, Defence and Border Affairs, and it gives them 25% of parliamentary seats, so it has a veto over constitutional change. And the idea was that civilians would operate within this order as a junior partner to the military, and this is what the military means by disciplined, flourishing democracy. But I think if we take a long-term view of the military takeover, the NLD has gradually tried to marginalize the military both through informal practices and formal constitutional change. And we can see that this started straight away, and we can see that, I think, over the last couple of years, civil-military relations have deteriorated to breaking point. This started straight away with the creation of the state councillor role for Aung San Suu Kyi in 2016. It proceeded through the reallocation of control over the General Administration Department from the Ministry of Home Affairs to a ministry controlled by civilians. It is expressed, perhaps in particular, through the civilian government's refusal to convene the National Defence and Security Council, which is dominated by the military, used to meet fortnightly under the Thein Sein administration. And the military has been openly protesting since late 2019 that this council must be convened, and has even tried to amend the constitution to give it more powers. We've also seen the NLD abolish the existing mechanisms for the peace process in favor of new ones dominated by Aung San Suu Kyi and her allies. And I think we've seen the military gradually marginalized and starting to set up its own parallel mechanisms from late 2017 onwards. And then, of course, there were the formal attempts to amend the 2008 constitution to eliminate the military's position in parliament and to end its institutional autonomy from civilian oversight. We've also seen the civilian government foot dragging on military recommendations on counterinsurgency operations. So, for example, it took them 4 years to designate ethnic minority armed organizations as terrorist organizations, despite the military calling for this. So if we take this long-term view, we can see that civil-military relations, never very good in the first place, have been deteriorating very substantially, and the military has been openly criticizing this for the last couple of years. And matters really came to a head, I think, around the 2020 elections, it is important to recognise, I think, that the Union Election Commission, which is appointed by the NLD government, was not very effective. It made many errors that were widely criticised by civil society, political parties, and independent observers like Human Rights Watch, for example. And it certainly antagonized the military by making decisions about where to cancel elections on security grounds that did not reflect military advice. The army's request after the election was held to hold supplementary elections in Rakhine to help support the ceasefire with the Arakan army was also rebuffed. And that's quite a significant development, I think, given that the fight with the Arakan army has been the most deadly armed conflict internal to Myanmar, probably over the last couple of decades, with hundreds of combatant casualties, which had also really collapsed government rule in large parts of Rakhine state. And also, I think the UEC did respond very dismissively to complaints from the opposition and the army. Now, we may well say, well, these complaints were baseless. And I think it's fair to say that whatever the level of error and even potentially fraud in the election, it would not really have materially changed the outcome. But there was a history of mistakes, which the military was warning were serious enough to maybe compromise the result. And then a public refusal to engage with the opposition and the military and release voter rolls and so on, combined, I think, with a public mockery of the military's claims at NLD post-election rallies. So you have these two things happening: the long-term decline of civil-military relations, with the military increasingly feeling that the order that it created in 2008 was not exactly working as intended, that civilians didn't know their proper place, which was to show deference to the military, to consult it regularly, to take its interests and perspective into account in running the country. And then matters came to a head with a short-term crisis where civilian governance was noticeably poor, coupled with the army being ignored and mocked. So from this perspective, it seems that the military's goal would be to reinforce the disciplined part of disciplined, flourishing democracy, to remind civilians that from the Tatmadaws' perspective, you are participating in government at our sufferance and you need to work collaboratively with us. The big question, which is not clear, is whether they think they can achieve this just by decapitating the NLD, such that the remaining NLD elites will be sufficiently cowed to know their proper place, or whether bigger steps will be needed, such as dissolving the NLD or even making changes to the voting system. In terms of external responses, I think it's very difficult to know what the outside world can do productively. I think it has still very little leverage over the military. And I spent a lot of time in my book, Societies Under Siege, explaining why sanctions had not worked in the 90s and 2000s. And I think they're quite unlikely to work now. And I can say more about that in Q&A if necessary. I do think that the outside world needs to do as much as it can to try to keep the civil society and democratic opposition on life support during this period of repression so that it can re-emerge, to build international support as much as possible, and threaten serious repercussions in the case of major violence, and to do whatever it can to deter a violent crackdown on the street protests, which must now be thought of as the major short-term risk in Myanmar, and to support opposition groups as much as possible so that if and when disciplined, flourishing democracy is eventually restored, these opposition groups can come back to the fore. Okay, I'll end there and now hand over to Dr. Khin Chi, who is an award-winning social anthropologist, the inaugural Daw Aung San Suu Kyi Gender Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, an activist scholar deeply involved with questions of social justice in Myanmar. Dr. Ma.
Thank you, Lee. Please close your eyes and imagine you are writing the blood type of your daughter on your arm and your number as a contact person, knowing exactly why you did it. Imagine holding your Buddhist prayers, beat tight, and giving blessing to your son. Farewell him for the day after he paid homage to you. Only knowing that your blessing might be the only protection for him. Imagine, following cultural beliefs, a mother will pull her skirt out and tie up her son's right arms and giving a blessing. This is the best weapon that she can give for him to protect for his life. Imagine a 20-year-old girl holding her 19-year-old sister. It was hit by the police from her at her back of her head in Nepal. Imagine a 16-year-old volunteer's head was split heart by the bullet and sniper. This morning, a 19-year-old student from Medical College had been violently arrested by the military for distributing drinking water. Do you feel it? Can you imagine it? Does it make sense for you? If they are your brother, your son, your daughters, your niece, and your nephew, that is the reality that Burmese young people are facing in Myanmar. Not without fear, the mother had to let their children go out to confront brutal and inhumane military. That is the reality of situation that youth are facing in our country in Myanmar. People have to safeguard their house every night from the police and military to come into their house. That is the reality of Myanmar. So why it is now? It is no longer anarchy. People in Myanmar see that it is a humanities. It is no longer anarchy and military between the split. It is about humanities. And it is also the restoring of the faith of young people, as you all know or heard, Generation Z. If we think demographically, Generation Z, born between 1995 and 2010, make up nearly 40% of population in Myanmar. 5 million of them are the first-time voters in Myanmar. They have seen 2015 election. They have been excited for the first time. They also seen their parents' excitement for the first time in their life. If we combine the first-time voter of 1990 election in Myanmar, at least three generations X, Y, and Z make up 63%. So when people voted for the first time, voter in 1990, their election result was rocked. They were cracked down. Many died. Many come out insane. Many never see their family again. That is the reality in Myanmar. So if we think about the brutalities that the parents experience, they know, even though they did not want or they don't want their children to go out, they have no other options because they do not want this experience, negative experience that they faced under military rules for the whole their life. So that is the reason the mother are risking. So what is the difference now? The Generation Z. Generation Z, if we see in terms of in Myanmar, the three Generation X, Y, Z are above like 4% of people because Burmese mortality rate is 67 years old. It's almost 90% are out there, outrageous. the injustice that military done to them. That is the core. But what Generation Z make it different is that they have experience in their lives. They are digital native. They learn technologies. Their parents could not even use mobile phone because it was illegal. Fax machine was illegal. They learn with mobile phone. So they have a different characteristic, and they also have a different context. So they are, unlike baby boomer or another generation, their behavior, their belief, their attitudes are different. Because at home, they have to struggle with their parents' view on mobile phone. Because their parents grown up under military rule, pedagogy of oppressed, fear of unknown. These generations are growing up with the technologies, digital. They try to reach out to the world. They are grown up in global village. They are listening to Justin Bieber, Amanda Gorman, greeters. Like they are connecting to the world. Last 5 years. And since 2012, many students also, many young people go out and learning in overseas. And they see it with their own eyes. And also last few years has opened up them opportunity to learn different multiple languages. So there is like a kind of they cannot go back to the dark age. They are determined. So, and it's really interesting thing that generation, if you think about generation, characteristic and behavior of generation. So because of they have experience at home with their parents who had image of the children grown up being doctors, and they are like kind of playing Mobile Legends. So they're like they struggle, they learn quickly that they cannot confront with their parents. And they can, because they cannot make a sense. So they just try to get what they want in their own ways. And they are also helping each other. Young people are helping each other and giving advice to each other. So this is the first generation that's true digital native. So it is like a kind of, and like anyway, they have it like a really oppressive parents of conservative parents that they don't learn about technology or digital, and they are new generation. So actually, the value are changing. So in the protest, you can see that they are using dress as a second skin to show as a tool of resistance. They are using performing arts as a tool. They are using technology and projectors and are showing in the dark the pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi, red paints, any activity, like kind of fashion show, everything they are using it. They are also critical thinker. We must remember that the opening of technology help them to be a critical thinker. You cannot tell them be a good boy, you will be in heaven. They are asking, what is heaven? If there's nothing in heaven, I don't want to go to heaven. Can you tell me how to escape from heaven? So this kind of generation, we must remember this. So this is like a kind of, and they have 4 points, values that they have. First one is they value individual expression. So individual expression, they don't really criticize, they don't really discuss, they just do individual. So when they are doing all their like technology things, their parents are doing prayer to the Buddhas, offering to the nut spirits. They will not interfere, they stop it. So, and also second point is that like kind of they are also mobilize themselves with multiple creative ideas and tactic and strategy. So can you imagine if you go to Twitter, they colonize Twitter of like all the UN celebrities, all the international famous people, they actually campaigning in Twitter. If you go to TikTok, they will be fighting with the soldiers of the low rank. But also, they are also outside of embassies, speaking Russian, German, Chinese, any kind of languages to the embassies, talking about their protest. And also, they are well connected. They are members of MIC Alliance, which is like Taiwan, Hong Kong, all the youth around the globe. They are also member of Anonymous. So like they are attacking military tactic. So they are also tech savvy. So they are also transparent and timely, and they use code number to contact each other. So point 3 is that they prefer dialogue over confrontation. That's what they learn from their experience in their family, because they cannot communicate with the family and society how they feel. Young people feel that they have no place to communicate because they're like in Burmese society still products of the pedagogy of the oppressed. So that's 3 points, and the third point is that they want to show, they want to communicate, they want to make a dialogue on conflict. And to stop the solution. That is where something that like, NLD establishment of CRPH and choosing Dr. Sasa as representative for UN is a very smart choice, because he is the one being born on the kitchen floor of Chin State and doesn't know about his date of birth. So actually, he is the same person calling of the military. So this kind of ideas, he suddenly come out to the Generation Z and they will find it. So it's really that finally really different. What is different? And the next one, next point I want to point out is this is not this is not about. Yes, 1 minute.
Yeah, 1 minute. 1 minute. Please. Yeah.
Yes. So that's my conclusion. So okay, 1 minute. And this is an intergenerational transnational activism. So actually, in Burmese, a lot of Burmese since 2012 being studying in international university around the world, and they are also campaigning doing that. And also, second is exile group. Burmese have been left from Burma and around the world. They are also fighting for this democracy movement. It is about 15%. And also CDM has been supported by every layers, and including migrants in Thailand who are working in 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, demeaning jobs, and made any low paid job. They are also sending money to support CDM. So the conclusion is that this is not about violence conflict. It is like mind games. The military is still using their own classic violence book. And young people, Generation Z, are using mind game, mobile legends game. So that's where we need to actually think who can play, how can play better. So I think I will conclude it by saying that yesterday, 5 years ago, Timberland voice, he stood up his mother in front of his mother and said, "Don't touch my mother. Don't arrest my mother. My mother is a good person. Go back. I don't believe in you." And unquote. And it was like 6 years old boy. So Burmese are feeling that we don't believe in you, the military. So that is about time to change, and they will not going back down. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma. Okay, next up is Dr. Nick Cheesman, who's fellow in the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University and the world's leading authority on Myanmar's legal system. Nick.
Thank you very much, Lee, for the introduction. And I also really appreciated your opening remarks and the insights that I got from Ma just now with regards to the situation of the protests. You did ask me to speak on the politics of law in the current situation in Myanmar, and I thought I would outline 3 brief points to get the discussion going. The first concerns the formal legality or otherwise of the takeover itself. The second is the use of positive law by the military junta. And the third relates to enforcement agencies, by which I mean primarily the police and courts. So the first thing to say with regards to the military itself is that we all know the military insists that it acted with, if not within, the terms of the 2008 constitution, that it oversaw the drafting of, as Lee, you mentioned at the outset of the discussion. And it makes that claim by virtue of the expedient that it removed the president from office and replaced him with the vice president, a former army officer. And that former army officer had one responsibility, and that was to sign into effect the state of emergency law that allowed the current junta to take over. I don't see how it's possible to sustain a claim that that's a legal takeover precisely because it was necessary to arbitrarily detain incommunicado the former president. Secondarily, even if we took a capacious view and we thought about it in terms of the Constitution itself providing for the military as the guardian of the Constitution, not the courts or the legislature, for instance, then even under those terms, it would be hard to make a case for this as being within the terms or along the terms of the Constitution, precisely because there was no existential order that called for the removal of the president and his replacement, let alone for the state of emergency that's now been declared. So we're in the curious situation that we have a state of emergency absent any kind of existential threat that would justify it, and also that would justify the kind of intervention that would enable the military to say it was acting, even in the most capacious sense of the term, according to its guardianship role that it had assigned for itself under that constitution. The second thing to say with regards to the use of positive law is that in the current activities of the junta, its subordinates and its indications of its intention, it exhibits many of the characteristics of its immediate predecessors in the 1990s and 2000s. In its insistence, especially of the application of positive criminal law against alleged wrongdoers. But also there are some interesting differences or suggestion of possible differences from those previous decades. That trivial ordinary criminal offences were brought against Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and the president, as well as many of the other political detainees presently, is entirely consistent with how positive criminal law was used in the 2000 against political dissidents. It was convenient for the military to do that for a variety of reasons, partly to do with the familiarity of the courts, police, and other institutions with the terms of the laws thusly used already. And secondly, from a political standpoint, when its ambassadors and other representatives went to Geneva or New York, they could disingenuously deny that there were any political detainees in Myanmar, saying that there were only people who had broken ordinary criminal laws, simple offenders. So in as much as it's doing that, it's consistent with previous occasions, and also in its use of, for instance, section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code to order curfews and limit gatherings, its use of sections like 505B of the Penal Code dealing with vaguely defined offences against public tranquility. All of this is very much consistent with previously. What's new, however, and quite bizarre, is the manner in which the junta has already worded and ordered amendments to the Penal Code, including Section 505B, but also the political offences of sedition and treason, in order to include specific references to the military as being a target of offences. And this is bizarre for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it's completely unnecessary to reword these sections in these terms. These sections of law were introduced to be very capacious political offences for use by a politically oppressive state, namely the British imperial state. And the drafters of those laws and the administrators and adjudicators who used them subsequently were quite open about the fact that these were offences that were so capacious that practically any statement against any part of the state could be brought within their parameters. So for these reasons, also subsequent juntas didn't see any need to change them and use them to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the period, quite effectively. And therefore the amendments to them seem to be quite crude and foolish. Either they're the result of bad advice or simply a response to orders, or if one was to take perhaps the most optimistic view, perhaps there's someone in and among the drafters who considers themselves part of the Civil Disobedience Movement, and one effective way to get the message out would be to make these sections, these amendments, look as ridiculous as they possibly can. The other reason that there's a difference here is that previously, certainly in the 2000s, for reasons I've already mentioned, there was a tendency not to use offences of this sort against political detainees, but instead just concentrate on the use of ordinary sections of law, as it were. So if the amendments that we see presently suggest that there may in fact be an intention to bring these to use these revised sections of law against offenders, then we may see, against political dissidents, then we may see a quite different kind of political case coming into the courts from those that we saw in the 1990s and certainly in the 2000s. The third and final thing to say, and this then goes to the work that the courts and the police do, is that in terms of the institutional arrangements, we again see quite a lot of continuity with previous periods, but also some divergences. As previously, police officers from townships and also police battalions have been at the forefront up until recently of the protests, and gradually they may be sequenced out as the military comes in to play a more active role in dealing with the protests. In any case, the evidence that we've seen so far from video footage and otherwise is that there is a certain amount of evidence of the use of training and equipment acquired over the last decade, activities in conjunction with the likes of the European Union that give the character of some of the police interventions at least a different quality to previously. How long that lasts is another question entirely, and perhaps in the last 24 hours or so we're seeing the fraying of those arrangements. As to exactly who is giving the police orders, if anyone in the audience knows who the current police chief is, I would be interested to know, because one of the announcements that followed from the junta's takeover on the 1st of February was that the police chief was permitted to resign. And I haven't yet seen any announcement of a replacement to that office. Lastly, with regard to the courts, and thanks, Lee, just noting that I'm out of time, and their part in all of this, they're already receiving cases against political activists and proceeding on them, as well as protesters and a variety of dissidents, and of course Aung San Suu Kyi and the president who's been arbitrarily detained. And there are also reports through AEPP and others of 1 or 2 convictions already. Now, courts everywhere in the world are laggards in periods of political and social change. And certainly the courts in Myanmar in the 2010s were very much behind the social and political change that we saw in that period. They changed their practices, perhaps arguably to the minimum extent necessary to accommodate the new circumstances. There was no significant change in personnel throughout this period. And so my sense, my expectation is that as the current political dissidents, detainees are brought into the courts, we shouldn't expect to see any difference in activity by judges and other participants in the court process from in the 2000s. They'll go about distinguishing between ordinary and political cases, as it were, appropriately convicting those people who fall into political or policy cases as they're required to do. And as in previous years, I think they're going to be reliable institutions for the military as long as it remains in power, and as long as it chooses to rely on the courts to do the work of enforcement of positive law for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, next we turn to Dr. Ashley South, who's a writer and consultant, a research fellow at Chiang Mai University in Thailand, and one of the world's leading experts on Myanmar's ethnic minorities and its torturous peace process. Ashley, over to you.
Many thanks, Lee, and good morning, or here in Chiang Mai, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Yeah, these are extraordinary times in Burma. I mean, these events are going to shape the country for many years to come. So, of course, it's a real privilege and kind of a responsibility to be commenting from outside the country. I'm going to touch on 3 subjects briefly. looking mostly as usual at issues of ethnic politics in the country. I think the first thing I want to talk about is the situation and the positions of some of Myanmar's ethnic armed organizations. I then would like to talk briefly about the possibility of this present crisis being a critical juncture, an opportunity for a fundamental realignment of politics in Myanmar in a positive way. And then I've got a couple of questions at the end rather than comments about, well, where do we go from here? That's the title of this seminar. What are the possibilities for dialogue or negotiation or not? So in the first few days after the coup, it was kind of eerily quiet, wasn't it? It was the protests really kind of got underway on the Saturday, Sunday, the 6th and the 7th. So the first few days after the coup, I had a few of my friends in Myanmar saying to me, well, these are ethnic nationality friends, saying, well, you know, we've exchanged a parliamentary authoritarian dictatorship for a military dictatorship. Maybe this isn't really going to make much difference for ethnic nationality communities in the country. And I think that explains why in the early days after the coup, some ethnic politicians, some ethnic nationality organizations were fairly cautious in their response. And indeed, as we know, a couple of ethnic political parties actually formally joined the SAC junta. But I think in the last couple of weeks since then, the stakes have now become incredibly high. As Dr. Khin was saying, this is no longer just about releasing Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, recognizing the election results, but really this has become a deeply symbolic but also, you know, very physically real, as Dr. Ma also reminded us, struggle for what kind of country Myanmar can be, should be. So I think, yeah, therefore the positions of ethnic armed organizations and other political stakeholders are very relevant. I think it's noticeable that the Karen National Union, maybe the longest established, certainly one of the major ethnic armed organizations in the country, issued a statement the day after the coup. It wasn't really, in my opinion, and others might disagree, I think it was really on the 13th of February when the New Mon State Party became the first EAO in the country to really explicitly stand with the people and issue a statement unequivocally denouncing the coup. And the next day, the Karen National Union came back with a second statement, very strongly opposing the military coup. We don't really have time to go through all the details because a number of different EAOs have positioned themselves. The peace process steering team, which brings together the 10 ethnic armed organizations which are signatories of the nationwide ceasefire agreement, issued a very strong statement on the 20th of February, making it really clear that the nationwide ceasefire agreement signatories do not recognize the SAC junta and effectively suspending the nationwide ceasefire agreement. I think ethnic armed organizations have been quite careful not to make it explicit, but I think the fact that key EAOs, particularly those in the NCA process, have made it quite clear that they don't recognize the junta and that it would be impossible to talk about the peace process with this illegal regime. I think that's very significant. Other parts of the country, ethnic armed organizations maybe have a little bit less room for maneuver. In the north, of course, China putting pressure on ethnic armed organizations and other stakeholders not to increase the instability and insecurity in Myanmar, and we don't really have time to get into the details, but I think China's role, in fact, has been quite interesting because obviously China has been framed as a major supporter of the junta, but I think behind the scenes, for example, at the UN in the Security Council, China's actually made it clear that there's quite strong disappointment or disapproval of the military coup. So I've talked about statements, but of course, you know, actions speak louder than words. And there's been a number of occasions where ethnic armed organizations have intervened on the ground to protect protesters and the Civil Disobedience Movement. Today in Kokrek Township in southern Karen State, there were clashes between the Karen National Liberation Army, that's the armed wing of the KNU, and the Myanmar Army. Some Myanmar Army soldiers were injured, maybe some fatalities, not sure. And this was with the KNU moving to stop the Myanmar army interfering with the movement of protesters. all of this, I think, needs to be remembered. It's in the context, since December, there have been increased Myanmar army attacks on ethnic communities in a number of areas in the country, particularly in Karen State, in northern Karen State. There are 6,000 new IDPs since mid-December as a direct result of Myanmar army attacks on civilians. So, you know, with these attacks in rural areas, but also obviously most of the attention is focused on the CDM movement in urban and peri-urban areas. I think there's a chance, let's hope not, of course, and I'm sure all of us are really thinking and, you know, in solidarity with the people of Myanmar. But if there is violent, increasingly violent crackdown on the protests, I think it may be that we'll see people fleeing the towns and cities, and a number of the ethnic armed organizations, particularly the KNU and the NMSP, again, have made it clear that they're standing by, ready to receive and support refugees and IDPs should that be necessary. So I guess just to touch on, and maybe we come back to this in the Q&A because I know time is limited, but this idea of critical junctures, I mean, what kind of change are we seeing in Myanmar? I want to argue that potentially what's happening now can be the substance of a really substantial transformation of state-society relations in Myanmar. And so I'm, of course, talking from the perspective of ethnic nationality communities, especially looking at conflict-affected areas. And for many ethnic communities in Myanmar, things were not going well before the military coup. The ceasefires were stalling, the peace process was really going nowhere, going backwards, really. I mentioned the Myanmar army attacks on civilians. And so I want to hope, I think is the right word, that this present crisis can be an opportunity to change the narrative, to reimagine Myanmar, transforming relationships between different communities in their struggle against the junta. We have seen some emerging alliances between NLD and activists. Dr. Marmar talked about the Generation Z youth. And I think one result of the junta's oppression is that it does provide a common experience, bonding different elements of Myanmar society together in new and creative ways. And this can perhaps be an opportunity, it's not a certainty, but because others have observed, I think that there is a lot of unity around what the protesters are opposing, that's the SAC military junta, but of course rather different visions of what Myanmar might be in the future. So I think based on the solidarity that's emerging, I want to at least hope that we can see a reorientation, a reimagination of what kind of country Myanmar might be. Yes, I'm running out of time. So I guess the third area I wanted to just briefly mention, and I hope this will be appropriate maybe to come back in the Q&A, is when, if ever, when might it be appropriate to engage with the SAC junta? You know, it's easy for me as a white male living in Chiang Mai to give my opinions. I mean, it seems to me that right now is not the time by engaging with the regime that just confers legitimacy to an illegal military coup. But my question is, at what point might the opportunity emerge for dialogue? And then I think really important to have the strategy ready, to have some ideas ready, not least in terms of who gets to be in the room, who gets to define the messages. So yeah, I think I'd better stop there, but I'm certainly very interested in particular to know what our friends from Myanmar, and particularly Thramu Pado Susanna has to say about this, the possibilities, maybe a little bit down the line of dialogue and negotiation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And our final speaker, we're very pleased to be joined by Susanna Hla Hla Soe, who is a long-time human rights activist, the founder of the Karen Women Empowerment Group, now an elected MP for the National League for Democracy, an incoming Karen Ethnic Affairs Minister for the elected NLD government. Susanna, over to you.
Sorry.
Susanna, you're
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. So I'm Susanna, and I would like to talk about our country's situation. As you all speak out, that we have the very emergency situation, and just this morning, the police tried to capture the activists and the young people in different area in Yangon, and as well as the other townships that today is like they try to support the UN representative, Dr. Sasa, and something like that. They have the different topic in every day of the general strike on the road. So they try to stop that kind of strike. So I just come to know that many people were arrested and torture and violence, including one of the Japanese reporters, but they just released that reporter. So the situation is worse since the military coup. We lost every aspect of freedom and media freedom and privacy and so and so. They just abolished the law of the privacy protection law, and also Honda, they try to reactivate the visitor registration law that it has been abolished for last 4 years ago at the parliament. So many people are living in very threat situation. And today there is a news that the CRPH member were surrounded by the police and so and so. So we all are very much worried. I by myself, as an elected minister, I could not stay at my home. Since a military coup, I have to stay away from my community and my home. Of course, in the day, I stay with my community. I encourage the strike, and I helping out the CDM movement. But at night time, you never know. Someone can knock your door and grab you. So most of the MP and minister, they could not stay at home. So, but on the other hand, I can see very good point, very good result from this for this event. So many activists, they work together, and especially we call Generation Z. They come up with their new idea, creative idea every day. So the people are very much support them. You know, they come up with, yesterday we have Tanaka. Tanaka is something like you put the $3 on your face, Tanaka campaign. They have like singing, and also the rapper and a car program campaign. So they are very creative. At the night time, they use the spotlight to show the people to support the democracy movement, something like that. And I also see that ethnic correlation this time. You know, we have very famous correlation among the ethnic nationalities. We call General Strike Committee for Nationalities. I always join that strike. Even I'm the NLD elected minister, I'm the ethnic minister, so I joined to that strike, and we work together. So the unity is highest level. First, when the General Z, they ask for, they come out to the road and they ask to respect their votes and release Aung San Suu Kyi and the leaders. But now the slogan changed to abolish 2008 constitution and build up the federal democracy nation and release all the political prisoners, something like that. So the people ask for wider perspective, and it is very encouraging. And many youth, they come up with their slogan, I regret that we neglect Rohingyas crisis. We neglect, we very regret to neglect the Kachin. Brother and sister are suffering. We neglect current brother and suffering. So this is very encouraging. The time for reconciliation, the time for unity, the time to restart our federal democracy. So I believe that this unity and this correlation can lead to abolish the military rules over our country. Because the people are enjoying the, we can say, semi-democracy for 10 years, since 2010, but they enjoy a lot. They know, they love the taste of democracy, the love of freedom of expression. So this time they can't accept the men with the guns to rule the country. So they just, for the time being, there are 6 casualties, 6 people casualties. So many brutal engagement from the gender, but the people don't stop their activities. They come up with on the road every day, and they help each other. Today, the community protect the students and the young people and the media, so that the military could not arrest them. So the unity of the community is the highest level. So, and the CDM, so the many people are talking about CDM. So we have reached our satisfaction of the CDM part. On the other hand, I worry a little bit about, they come up at the night time to the CDM staff and they arrest the people. So the government staff are very worrisome about it. So they don't feel that they are safe. So I don't know for the long term. So the budget also the other question, because we are not ready to be open. We are not ready to give the salary for all CDM staff. So this is a other question. So anyway, we are hoping for the best, and I hope that the international community is with us. And as Dr. Sasa, our UN representative, told yesterday, we welcome gender to sit on the table and negotiate and dialogue. Why not? Because if they would like to build a better future, we would like to build a better future for Myanmar people. Why not? We can sit and talk together. So this is the result we want. But as you know, in the history, the junta, they never use the negotiation way. They just end up with killing and brutal, and they just use the weapons. But we think soft power can win hard power with the unity and with the international pressure. And I also would like to ask the international community to use your most highest power, like ICC, ICJ, and R2P, to draw the attention of the hunter to come back to the right way, because this time we are on the crossroad. We never come back. We will never come back this kind of unity for this time. So this is the time for work together, like civil society, community, international pressure, EAO, and UN. So we are full with hope on the other hand, we also need the international support to build the better future for our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for that mixture of concern and hope. We're now opening up to questions. There have been several questions put in the Q&A. Please also use that. And if you prefer to speak, then you can raise your hand and I will come to you. There are a couple of questions. One is from Dan Casper, which is in the chat rather than the Q&A, saying, what can the outside world do to influence the military government over the next year? And the kind of related question from Zunetta Herbert, saying that sanctions could surely work now because they could be more targeted at the Myanmar military. So maybe we just start with that one about, this is the question about what the outside world can do, should do to influence things on the ground. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which is a site that curates various ways to support the different groups involved in civil disobedience and anti-coup resistance on the ground. But maybe I'll come back to Susanna first and say, what is it that you are asking the outside world to do? You mentioned a few things, but maybe you could go into more depth.
Yes, targeted sanction, we support that action. So the men with gun, they are very careful their money, the money from their pocket. So targeted sanction is very effective. But as I have told that the other way that we can influence is like ICC, ICJ, and the taking action to the individual and the military leader is also needed, because they don't care. They don't care the people's lives. They don't care the democracy. They don't care the international rules and regulation. Actually, the coups is like it's not. We can say that not institutional coup. In even the 2008 Constitution, it's not allowed military coup for that with the like election fraud. Now they give the reason, election fraud. So this is not institutional. This is a high treason of the gender. So we because we already have the mechanism to take the action to the hunter. So I also would like to support the idea to take action through the international law, like ICC and ICJ, and targeted sanction and the armed embargo. It is very important. So the people are very much fed up with the men with the gun. Our people are very fed up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Ashley, do you have any thoughts on this particular issue? What the outside world can and should do?
Well, yeah, I mean, targeted sanctions sounds good. Yes, I think there are people here, including in the audience, people like Zunetta, for example, who know more about this than me. I think it's targeted sanctions, but also it's the symbolism, isn't it? It's saying we won't put up with this. I think that's really important. But as well as pressure on the junta, which is certainly appropriate and necessary, I think it's going to be important to support the civil disobedience movement and more broadly to support civil and political society in Myanmar. I mean, one of the consequences of the CDM is that I think the Myanmar economy is on the edge of collapse. And of course, that's a strategy. And it's going to also have impact on the ability of regular people and civil society actors, political parties, everyone really, just to keep going. So as well as putting pressure on the regime, I would want to suggest that it's really important to support the CDM and to support a wide range of different stakeholders in Myanmar. Because of course the military launched the coup and they are well prepared. I'm sure they have their stocks of cash, rice, bullets already well prepared. So it'll be important to provide financial and as well as sort of symbolic and spiritual support to pretty much everyone in the country who isn't part of the military, because it seems at the moment that the support for the CDM and more broadly the opposition to this military coup is very widespread, extremely widespread.
Thank you, Ashley. Dr. Ma, maybe I can come to you and ask you this question, because there's also a specific question aimed at you from Lewin McClay, who is a Myanmar citizen living abroad and wants to know how do we help? What can we do from overseas? So maybe you want to talk about what ordinary people can do as well as external governments.
I think is at the moment is we feel like international community make a voice louder sanction, louder targeted sanction, that they need to hear it. It is a very important because of like at the moment, Burma spoken out loud and clear, but international community targeted sanction need to be visible and known and loud. And also such as like they target the CV, MMTF and MEB, etc. Right, like we can actually do that, like focus on revenue stream. Second thing is that as like an individual, we all can contribute. Because and if you are in overseas in your country, talk to your local MP, make it speak up at the parliament, speak out, make a petition, make a campaign to join Burmese youth and to against the military. And we need to hear the voice from the international community very loud, because at the moment is every day it is danger. Every night, today, if we think about 88, the strategy of the military, they try to send out ex-COVID to the society, then they will start to implement the visitor registration law to target everybody at their home. And nobody can host anyone. The fear will spread out. That is the end of the movement. So that is really important that like now, more than ever, we need an international and individual voice to speak up to your local authority, local MP. We need to actually take action now. And also like there's an international collaboration that people are doing with students, international student bodies, we have academic bodies. We are supporting and so like find out and link to us and we will send you information.
Thank you, Ma. Nick, do you have any thoughts on this?
This is not my area of expertise, so I'm reluctant to weigh in with additional thoughts, but I just had a quick footnote, and that was, yeah, if the military does have its way, and we are all hoping that it doesn't, and the CDM program is successful, I think that goes without saying, but supposing that it does succeed in pursuing its agenda, then we ought not think that it will be only for a period of 1 year. It's clear that the changes that are being made presently could lead to it to extend or attempt to extend beyond a period of 1 year. It could claim within the terms of the Constitution, again, disingenuously, up to 2 extensions for another year. And then beyond that, there's at least 6 months that also could be a period in which power is transferred to the National Defence and Security Council before an election. So even within the terms of the 2008 Constitution, disingenuously applied, the military could claim up to 2.5 years before it's necessary to return power to an elected government.
Yeah, thank you. I think Ma wants to ask you a question, actually, Nick. So I'll bring you back in.
Nick, you have been working for police for a long time, right? So like, you have been doing research. So I have two questions. First, how much they have improved in the last 5 years? Second question, how can we do divide and rule within themselves? Do you have any advice or strategy or tactic that you can give from his youth? How can we use divide and rules within the police forces? Thank you.
Thank you, Ma. And that's also a question from Helene von Spanek in the Q&A, that there has been some dissent in the police force. Some police personnel have joined the protests. Is there any prospect for a police split? What do you think about that, Nick?
Thank you. How much have they improved? That's a good question, Mama, that I would be interested to hear from people who worked closely with the police and get their assessment. I have observed video footage of some of the events that they've been involved in the last couple of weeks. And of course, if Susanna Hla Hla Soe has points to add based on her observations, I'd be very keen to hear them. My sense is that looking even at the events in Mandalay at the dockyard, you can see evidence of training that the police received, especially the battalions, the police battalions, which of course are effectively, they're a de facto military force, not a police force, have received over the last few years, as well as the township and district level police. It's noticeable, for instance, that there were women officers present in the foreground of those events, a manner in which also the police are moving in and organizing themselves suggests some degree of training being implemented. And also, of course, the presence of water cannons and so on. Having said all of that, how long will all of those practices persist for? I think what we'll see is that there'll be gradually a return to the old-fashioned techniques. And then we know that it will reach a point where the police, and indeed we're seeing that right now, we may be on the cusp of it, that the police are withdrawn and the military take over entirely, because in no case where there are large-scale events of this sort will the police be kept in the foreground and with the intention that they will successfully break up the protest movement. It's simply not going to happen. The military, as always, will reach a point that it will come forward and do that. But the police are expediently used in the interim, and perhaps, again, somewhat cynically and disingenuously. So in some ways that perhaps makes the second question, I don't want to say unimportant, but a little bit less important, because the real question, as we always know, is, well, what happens when the police are withdrawn and the military is brought forward? And therefore, likewise, the question of a police split, I think, is in some ways perhaps redundant. We do notice that there are some police officers that have gone over in some protests to the side of the protesters, but it looks like for the most part those actions have been spontaneous or have been decided a short time in advance. They're relatively low-ranking personnel. Some of them, again, according to AAPP and other sources, have already been detained and charged under the police discipline law. And so I wouldn't pin my hopes, as it were, either on a police split of any significance. And in any case, it's not the police ultimately that will be the violence specializing force that will be responsible for using violence at a large scale to resolve, from the military junta's point of view, to resolve these events.
Thank you, Nick. I'll also address this question about the outside world and the sanctions point. I suppose in a way that might not be very popular, but I have to give my honest praise of this, which is that there's very little plausible causing the imposition of sanctions and the military's withdrawal from power. Because the military are not motivated by pecuniary goals when they step. And the military, as I mentioned right at the start, is the most powerful force in Myanmar. It's very difficult to see how anybody can forcibly dislodge them. I don't think that they can be brought down economically through sheer and I don't think that they particularly care what the outside world thinks about them. And so they're not going to be subject to external moral pressure either. And I don't think creating pressure on the economy as a whole is something I think this time around civil society activists, the movement itself, is very reluctant to advocate. Targeted sanctions, yes, but targeted sanctions that are just kind of asset freezes and visa bans on individuals are not going to have any effect at all for the reasons that I've given. Targeted sanctions that target military companies start to be entrenched in Myanmar's political economy. So when you start hitting those businesses, you'll start to hit lots of other people as well. And that's when people start to get queasy about it, and the utility of it is even more questionable. You know, my view is that the military has intervened for a specific purpose, which is to try to discipline the civilian politicians and the opposition, and it's unlikely to withdraw from power until it achieves that goal, at least on the surface. So I think, as Ashley says, they've tried to emphasize that they're acting within the constitution. We can analyze that and say, well, they're not, but they are trying to stress that they are tells you, I think, that politically they're trying to defend that constitutional order and beef up the discipline side of disciplined flourishing economy, democracy rather. And so I think you have to think about what it is that will, while minimizing the damage to democratic bloodshed. And so I think it is important to try to hold them that they are going to hold elections and withdraw. I know it is very controversial because people on the ground do not want any external group to legitimize the coup by engaging with the government and saying, okay, you're going to hold elections, you know, move things along. And that's the Indonesian government, which is already trying to intervene in the situation, is finding a lot of pushback against that approach. But I think that it's not an idiotic position to take, to try to push the military along and hold it to its own word. I do think that they're not going to say, oh, sorry, we shouldn't have done this. All of our complaints against the UEC were nonsense. We were wrong. Let's withdraw in humiliation to the barracks. I just think that's simply not going to happen. I do think that there is greater scope for establishing an international consensus that they should withdraw and that they should go back to holding elections as quickly as possible. There's greater room for consensus now than there was in 2017 over the Rakhine atrocities, for example, because China, I think, is this. It has a lot of money in courting the NLD government and civil society. And ASEAN is already starting to react and try to encourage progress and condemn attacks on protesters, as it has in the past when the military was in power in the past, and ASEAN feels its own credibility at stake. There is greater scope to build that kind of consensus that this needs to be a time-limited intervention. They're going to be held to their word. And I think there needs to be a strong threat of meaningful retaliation if there is any significant military crackdown on the protesters, to try to deter that for as long as possible. Because I think Nick is absolutely right, that if the police cannot restore order, it is only a matter of time before the military step in and rotate elite troops onto the streets to kill people in potentially potentially large numbers. That has to be the number one thing that we try to avoid in the medium term. And the other thing, which relates to the questions that we've had around potential splits in the military, is to try to make as clear as possible in all the messaging, both official and in media, for example, through the BBC Burmese, that the beef the outside world has is with the military leadership that has taken this decision to suspend democracy in Myanmar, and not necessarily with the military itself or with the state. We need to try to encourage as much as possible the cognitive dissonance within these institutions. It is notable, for example, that if we look at areas where large numbers of military personnel are stationed and live, that they are voting NLD. There are the generational shift that Dr. Ma talks about is not limited to people outside of the military. It's also happening within the military itself. Younger people in the military are not only subject to military brainwashing in the way that they were in the past. They're also now online. They're seeing different sources of information. They don't necessarily support what their leaders are doing. So I think we need to be very careful about playing into an us and them hyper-nationalist scenario, which would encourage the military to rally around the leadership. We want to encourage splits as much as possible, because that is where the military will be more reluctant to enforce a crackdown on the population. Okay, there are a number of other questions that have come through. There are a set of questions about well, there's one question from David Brenner, directed particularly at Ashley, and Ashley, you can see the full text of that in the Q&A. I suppose what David is saying is, what are your reflections on the national ceasefire agreement framework and the peace process that you've been involved in light of the coup, and what lessons would you draw for donor support to peace process going forwards? So that's a specific one for you. And then there's a couple of questions about the committee to represent the People's Little, which I think Susanna might be best placed to talk about. What role would that play? What is its relationship with ethnic minority parties and the armed organizations? And why is there no upper house part for that committee? So, Susanna, can I bring you in to address those questions about that?
Yes. When we are talking about CRPH, this is the only one committee that representing Myanmar people for the time being, because CRPH is representing more than 400 member of parliament elected in 2020 election. And not only NLD, the other ethnic party from Kaya and from Taong, they also included in the committee. So they work as not the government, but as a steering committee to lead the right direction. So they issue the orders, and they challenge the gender military rule. They also have the subcommittee for the international relations. I think they have the 4 committees, subcommittee, the international relation, and also ethnic affairs committee, and legal, and other one is public relations. So altogether 4 subcommittees working in the different area. So for the time being, in the public relations committee, they issue the order to form the public the transitional administration group in the grassroots area. So now it's starting now. The people follow the order, so they form the transitional administration group in the up till village level. And for the international, they have the good communication with the international community, embassies, and UN, and so and so. And for the ethnic affairs committee, they have the meeting with the the ethnic political parties and EAOs and so on. And so I think they concluded the common goal already, because I also check with them and what they are. I'm not in the CRPH, but I work closely with them. I support them. So these are the CRPH, what they are doing now. So we also worry for their security, because the gender is looking for them to prevent them to do such things. So the security is very important, and the high level of security protection is needed for them. And so it is all about CRPH, right?
Yes, thank you, Susanna.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Ashley, do you want to come in that question from David?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Brenner, for that question on the NCA. It's a really big question, and I'm going to use the excuse of limited time to kind of duck, really, because I think it deserves a much fuller answer from me. I mentioned in my comments earlier that I think the ethnic armed organizations have been careful, even those who have been very strongly denouncing the coup, to say that the NCA is unworkable at the moment, but not necessarily completely finished. But really, I think it's very difficult to see any way back to the peace process that has been going since 2012. So I guess this comes back to the idea of the present situation as a critical juncture. And I think that includes reimagining the basics of the peace process. I think it has to start again. Part of the question, I think, was about international support. And there's a lot of comments recently before the coup and continuing now about whether the Joint Peace Fund is really fit for purpose. And I certainly think one of the, coming back to my earlier comments as well, it's extremely important, I think, to continue to support the more progressive elements of Myanmar society during this period of potential really economic collapse. And I think that includes working with some of the ethnic armed organizations, both those who are in the formal peace process, but others also, to encourage them to be as accountable, as inclusive, as rights-based as possible. And I guess linking to what Susanna just mentioned about the CRPH and the question about the manner in which individual communities or wards or even at least on paper some cities and regions are declaring independence from the SAC junta. And I think it's also worth, of course, remembering that among Myanmar's ethnic armed organizations, several of the bigger groups, including some of those I've mentioned today, have their own areas of control which have long been separate to the Myanmar state. So areas of ethnic armed organization control, but also mixed administration areas where authority is shared or contested between EAOs and the government. So I certainly hope that the CRPH will be talking to, and I know this is happening, engaging with some of the EAOs to take account of those realities on the ground. And I guess this is maybe my last chance to put in my 10 jat worth. I mean, it seems to me that one of the striking characteristics of the present situation is both sides are convinced they are winning. I mean, I personally don't have any contact with the SAC junta, but of course, you know, one talks to people in the diplomatic community, etc. My understanding is that the generals think they're winning, and they're looking to consolidate control and dig in for the next several years, as Nick was perhaps mentioning. But clearly the CDM has massive support and momentum and very, very strong, passionate struggle for justice and against this military coup. So that seems to be a recipe for probably an increase in confrontation over the coming weeks, maybe months, because neither side shows any sign of backing down. And so I think that means that we may see greater violence going forward. I, of course, hope that's not the case, but as both sides do seem to be convinced that they're on the up, I think that might be expected.
Thank you, Ashley. we're really over time. So Nick, do you have any final comments? Maybe just 1 minute.
No, I agree with those closing remarks by Ashley. The only thing to add is that if indeed Generation Z is the generation which is largely responsible for these protests, then unlike some our colleagues from Myanmar here in this discussion, nobody from that generation has seen what the army can do on the streets in Myanmar.
Thank you, Nick. And Dr. Ma, the last word to you, 1 minute.
I think.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's we know that what we are taking the risk because we've seen it, we have been through. So that's like and we have been, many of us are political prisoners, and so we have been through. So this is like a fresh light that we need to catch. So as an international community can do a lot of things if Burma is silent, and including supporting CDM fundraising and raising political prisoners, and also pressuring on international community to walk the talk, not just talk the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists today, especially those in Myanmar who are usually out banging pots at this time of night. And thank you to all of you for coming. We did get to most of your questions. I apologize to those of you that we weren't able to address, but I'm sure there'll be many opportunities to discuss this more in future. Thank you all.